In this video, I'm going to tell you about indie tabletop miniature wargaming. And what's wrong with indie games anyway? I suspect that most of you probably know that when you hear the word indie, it refers to independent. It's short for independent. So there's indie music, there's indie art, there's all kinds of different indie, and there's indie things within the realm of tabletop gaming in general, indie RPGs, indie board gaming. There's also indie tabletop miniature war games. And they're very different, obviously, than the big companies, right? Now, when I say big companies, I'm talking about within our very tiny industry, tabletop miniature wargaming. Games Workshop is obviously the biggest in the industry, but again, as a corporation, they're much smaller than many other corporations, even within regular tabletop gaming, and then with you just in the general world, they're not very big at all. But we're not talking about, oil companies or, computer manufacturers. We're talking about our small little weird niche. And within our small little weird niche, there are big companies like Games Workshop and Mantic and Weird and Warlord Games. And then there's a bunch of real small indie companies. And I'm kind of interested in indie stuff more than not these days. Now, what makes a company indie? There's no hard and fast, this is how much they make, this is how many employees, this is how nice their offices are. It's kind of one of those, you know it when you see it sort of situations, People talk about Osprey Press, and sometimes they can be kind of referred to as an indie company, even though they have professional printing and all that stuff. And they are actually owned by a larger publishing company, from what I understand. But they make small runs of things in those little blue books like Zona Alpha, which is an indie game that I love. It just happens to be published by a kind of a not exactly hard to tell, maybe is it or not an indie company, or is it just a regular company? There are also a lot of hobby presses out there. Now, what that means, a hobby press is meaning that, let's say, the one or two or three people that run the hobby company, the game design company, it's a hobby to them. They have day jobs, right? So there's a lot of that going on in the indie world. There are people who are doing it, frankly, because of the love of the games, and that's very cool. And that's the kind of stuff that I like to focus on sometimes. Now, we have to get this out of the way right away. Indie games are very frequently lower budget. If you are very, very concerned about the hardcover and the quality of the fancy paper and the full color and all that, and the super just mind-blowing art, if that's a super big importance to you and a deal breaker, then indie games are probably not going to be for you. As I mentioned, indie games are generally done by very small groups of people who are probably doing it on the side as a second job. And that's fine, but they very frequently don't have the ability to get high-end art. They don't have the ability to get high-end, layout and design. And that's still the information is the important part, right? But if you are absolutely like, I can't look at this, it's just a normal, just plain design layout on a white with a black thing, and is not a very good piece of artwork. If that's a deal breaker, understand that maybe now's the time to stop the video. But if you like interesting, cool games that are very, very different than the mainstream, keep watching. So back in the olden days, it was generally, if you were going to do your own indie kind of game development, you had to get it printed somewhere, usually someplace local to the designer, and then hopefully maybe you could take it to some local conventions and try to get it sold there, or maybe your local store would sell it on consignment for you if that was, if they were like, nice people and stuff like that. But we live in a much different time now with digital distribution and PDFs, portable document format. Most indie games are generally released in portable document format, PDFs, which means you can look at them on your phone, you can look at them on your iPad. I can carry a lot of different, and I currently do carry a lot of different rule sets for different indie games on my iPad, which I really, really like. Laptop, whatever you want to do. You could print them, or you just don't, you just keep them on the screens. Up to you. Many of these companies also, though, will work with slightly larger companies, not larger game companies, but more almost like a distribution company to make it easier for people to get the PDF. But also, they will frequently have something called print on demand. So you can set the file up that you're going to use to, as the PDF to be also something that can be printed and bounded as an actual book, maybe with a hardcover, maybe with a soft cover. Could be color on the inside, could be black and white, lots of different options. But that print on demand is nice because you're not sitting on a garage full of stuff that you got printed and spent your whole life savings on. If someone says, yeah, I want that book, then the company says, okay, cool. They print one and ship it off. And As a person who's worked in printing for a long time back in the past, actually print on demand looks pretty good these days. I've bought a bunch of different print on demand books recently, and I've been real happy with every single one of them. Understanding, again, this is more of a kind of quality thing, but I think there's a big benefit to PDF. You know, sitting down and saying, geez, I hope I can get in and order this game before it goes out of stock. And geez, you know, I hope that it ships and gets here in time and stuff like that. As opposed to just being like, boop, I'm going to buy me a PDF and it's going to be here in a couple of minutes. And I don't have to worry about limits or being out of stock or anything along those lines. I think that's a big benefit. Very frequently, indie games are miniatures agnostic. Now, I think I've talked about that a little bit before, but what that means is that there is no particular miniature line that is attached to the rules. Bigger companies have a tendency to try to sell you rules and the miniatures at the same time, which makes a lot of sense. They're trying to actually just get you to buy the miniatures. And in many situations, unless you're one of the biggest companies, you usually give the rules away for free as a PDF and just to get people to buy more miniatures. I talked about why some companies charge for rules and why some don't. Pachow. But with indie games, they're going to charge you for the rules because that's the only thing that they're selling. This gives you a lot more freedom in your creativity as you're building your warband or your group or your crew or whatever like that. Understand that also a lot of, maybe most, but not all, but a lot of indie games are generally designed to be skirmish style as opposed to full-blown big army or rank and flank, moving around huge groups of units and stuff like that. So if that's also your kind of interest area, you can put a lot of time and effort and creativity and kit bashing into what you want to do for these particular kind of miniature agnostic rules. You can certainly use the models you already have from the big companies out there, Mantic and GW and things like that. If you can go, okay, cool, I need a neat robot, this guy will work, great, boom, that's fine. But you can also take stuff from other companies out there, like other indie companies themselves to some degree, people who produce things in resin, people who produce things as STLs via Patreon and stuff like that. Pachow talked about that recently too, and how that's really starting to change the industry. It gives you so many different options to be able to build the game and play the game the way that you want to. That's another big benefit I like about indie games, because I love being able to sit down and not just say, let's just quick play. I like to get the rules and then sit down and figure out how am I going to build this warband, or very frequently, how am I going to build 2 warbands so that I can then become an advocate to teach people this game, because it's probably not very well known because, indie. Another great aspect to indie games, in my opinion, is that the rules themselves are very frequently designed to take more risks design-wise. When you are a big corporation that frankly has shareholders to please, a lot of employees to pay, all that kind of stuff, you got to keep the lights on, got to pay rent on the building, all that kind of stuff, you are looking at this from the aspect of a business, which is totally understandable because it turns out you're a business. That makes sense. You make games, but you're a business that makes games, and so you have to keep making money to be able to keep this whole machine rolling down the road. When you have a day job, and your friend has a day job, and you kind of crank some stuff out, and you make a game that you are passionate about and that you really enjoy, you don't have to worry about as much, is this going to hit, and are we going to be able to hook every last person out there who's in tabletop miniatures land? Am I going to be able to make enough money to pay my mortgage? This is, again, a hobby press. This is a side thing for a lot of people. And so because of that, the rules can be a lot more interesting sometimes. You can take a lot more risks with the way that the game is designed and played, sometimes even presented. And that's really interesting to me as well, as a person who's, I've played a bunch of the big stuff, but I'm also interested in seeing what's going on in these other weird little nooks and crannies within the industry. Lastly, I'm not a competitive player very much. And if you're a competitive player, there's nothing wrong with that, number one. Number two, indie games are probably not going to be for you. The reason for this is that indie games have a tendency to focus on story, campaign, forging a narrative, however you want to put that, but they're not usually focused on competition. Now, the reason for that is because if you make an indie game that is competitive only, has no campaign rules, has no real story, it's just a competitive game, it's going to be real hard for you to get a tournament together for that when there's literally only 100 people in the world that know about it. You know what I mean? There are indie games out there that are all about me and this other person, and we're playing. Maybe we're having a campaign that goes on for 20 games. Maybe it's 10. Maybe it's 6. Maybe it's a 3 or 4 person campaign, and we're alternating back and forth, and that's great. That's the way most of those work. If it comes down to we want to have a cool 48 player, 24 table, timed tournament, it's going to be real hard to get everybody to come together, because everybody from all over the world who plays this game would have to come to one place. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It does. It just doesn't happen a lot. So understand that if you're really into competitive play, that very possibly, again, indie games might not be for you. But if you love campaign play, building a story, and just that kind of enjoyment, you're going to definitely want to take a look. So there's plenty of indie games out there that I like, and I'll put some links down below. Some of them may even sort of straddle the line and things like that, but I'm still going to put them down in the description, and take a look and see what you think. If you've got an indie game that you like that you'd like to share with other people, also put that in the comments, because I really like the concept of people sitting down and designing something for the love of the design and the love of play, and then sharing it with other people so that they can get really passionate about the creative aspect of building the stuff for that, and then the actual play and the creating the story as that play session or multiple play sessions goes on. So if you've got something, an indie game that you dig, throw it down in the comments. And if you're interested in thinking about maybe some, checking out some indie games, take a look at some of those links in the comments.